Final Destination 3, The Novelization by Christa Faust. Chapter 3. "Come on, Wendy," said Jason. "Take my picture with old Scratch over here." Jason clambered up into the planter to stand beside the fiberglass devil. He threw his arm around its cherry-red shoulder and gave Wendy a goofy grin and a thumbs up. "Jason," she said, "you're going to get us thrown out." "Not if you hurry up and take the picture," he replied. Wendy sighed, then lifted the camera and snapped the shot. The coaster's car screamed through a loop overhead. Wendy looked up anxiously as Jason stepped down to rejoin her. Ahead of them, Kevin, Carrie, Lewis, and Veronica were standing at the entrance waiting for them to catch up before they joined the line that snaked deep into the heart of the coaster's center. Arrows directed those with fast passes one way and lesser beings the other. The entrance was shaped like a demon too, a giant beast that straddled the way in with arms and wings stretched wide. "Come on, J-Dog," Kevin called impatient. "Did you get it?" Jason asked. "Huh?" Wendy frowned. "Oh, yeah, sure, I got it." Jason seemed to notice her nervousness and put his arm around her. "You're not going to back out now, are you?" he asked. "It would be a waste of ticket." No, she said. "It's just—" She paused, uncomfortable. "You ever have that deja vu feeling, like all of this has happened before, only for something that hasn't happened yet?" Jason chuckled. "That's an old gag. Vuja day, the feeling that none of this has ever happened before." His smile faltered as he saw that Wendy wasn't joining in on the joke. He frowned. You're really weirded out about this, huh?" She shrugged, not looking up. Jason stepped in front of her. He gripped her shoulders and tilted her head up. He looked into her eyes. "Hey, listen to me, Wendy. I know you. I know how much trouble you have letting go. You always got to be in control. I think that's why coasters freak you out. They're all about not being in control, but you gotta learn to live a little. Let go a little. And this is about the safest way to do it on the planet. Roller coasters are safer than airplanes, and airplanes are safer than cars. And you don't freak out when you're riding shotgun in my car, do you?" "Do you?" Wendy shook her head. "So there you go," Jason concluded. "You got no reason to freak out, right? It's supposed to be fun. Have some fun." "I know you're right," Wendy said. "I just can't help it. I keep getting this unshakable feeling something's going to go horribly wrong." "Come on, Wednesday," Jason said. "You need to meet your fears head on. That's the only way to beat them." Wendy looked down, embarrassed. She had a fierce urge to throw her arms around Jason and tell him she couldn't wait, that she wanted to go home with him right now. She knew how badly he wanted to finally make love to her, and knew that if she asked him to go now, he would do it without hesitation. But the very thought of using his desire to manipulate him like that made her feel just as disgusted with herself as she was with Ashley and Ashlyn. She couldn't do that to him just because she had a spooky feeling. "Would you guys come on?" called Kevin. Wendy pulled in a long, slow breath and forced herself to relax. "Okay," she said. "I'm sorry. I'm over it. Let's go." "Excellent!" Jason took her hand and they joined the others. "About time," Kevin said. He and Carrie turned to the turnstile. Jason and Wendy followed, but Lewis and Veronica were there before them. They were trying to push through, but the three huge stuffed animals got caught in the turnstiles. An attendant noticed their struggle and stepped forward. You can't bring those on the ride," he said, shaking his head. "Sorry." Come on, dude," said Lewis. The attendant shook his head. "I don't make the rules, man," he said. Lewis grunted. He piled his stuffed bear on top of the two animals Veronica was carrying. "Go wait at the exit," he ordered. "I ain't missing this ride." Veronica pouted, big brown eyes looking as sad as the eyes of the giant blue panda she was carrying, but she said nothing. She walked quietly back out of the entrance, shoulders slumped and submissive. "What a jerk," Wendy said under her breath. Lewis pushed through the turnstiles, and the others followed him in. Wendy shivered as they went under the devil's legs. She hurried after Jason as he led them all toward the fast-pass lane. They wound through a maze of railings and at last reached the back of the line. There was another spread-leg demon here, guarding the entrance to the loading platform. Wendy saw Ashley and Ashlyn leaning on the rail. Kneeling before the girls with the tiny handheld digital video camera was Frank Cheek, the guy Wendy had always thought of as the creepiest kid in the school, until he'd graduated 2 years before. He was a skinny, peculiar guy with blue-tinted sunglasses and greasy 70s hair, an ill-conceived combination of Rob Evans and Bob Gucciani, with all the fey flair of the former, coupled with the icky perversity of the latter. Wendy made a face. He was living up to his sleazy reputation in spades. He waved his arm at Ashlyn as he looked at the flip-out screen on his camera. "Ashlyn, Ashley," he crowed, "where you are right now, if you raise your hands, it'll look like you're holding the devil's balls." Ashlyn and Ashley curled their slick red lips in perfectly mirrored sneers. "Yeah, right," Ashley said. "And we'd want to do that." "Why?" Ashlyn asked. Frank leered, giggling. "Huh, where else you ever gonna find a dick that big?" Ashlyn rolled her eyes. "We're looking at one right now," she said. Frank grinned. Oh, so you heard." "Yeah, right," Ashley said. "Dream on, Mr. Peanut," Ashlyn said. Frank laughed, a high-pitched, demented giggle, but seemed otherwise unfazed by their catty sniping. "You two are smoking," Frank said. "Get out of here, Frank," Ashley said. "Yeah," Ashlyn said. "You already graduated like 2 whole years ago." "Sure," Frank said, "but I had to come and check out you two hotties, now that you're officially legal." The girls rolled their eyes and ignored him as they followed the moving line through the second set of turnstiles. He hurried after them, camera zooming in on their swaying behinds as they walked. Wendy turned away in disgust and noticed the usual warning sign next to the turnstiles. "Devil's Flight is a high-velocity thrill ride. Due to the forces created by this ride, for your safety, guests must be in good health and free from heart conditions, nervous disorders, weak backs, necks, or other physical limitations. No cameras or loose items allowed." Wendy took her camera from around her neck and palmed it. She had no pockets big enough to put it in. Below the warning sign was another sign. A cartoon devil pointed to the turnstiles that controlled access to the loading platform. No exit after turnstiles. The devil was winking. A word balloon over his head said, "I'll see you soon." Jason pushed through the turnstile without a pause, but Wendy hesitated, looking up at the demon looming over her. She took another deep breath, clenched her jaw, and stepped through. The ratchet of the turnstile sounded loud in her ear. Clack, clack, clack. She joined Jason and the others. At the front of the line, an attendant was directing people to stand in numbered lanes along the edge of the platform. Jason stepped out of line to count the people in front of them. "I want to see where we're going to end up," he said. "We got to get front seat. We just gotta." Wendy swallowed. She'd said she would go on the stupid ride. She hadn't said anything about sitting up front. A train roared up the platform in a cacophony of hissing hydraulics and popping electrical current. The noise sounded as loud as fireworks in Wendy's ears. She flinched. The bright red train was segmented like a centipede, with only 2 side-by-side seats to each section, and a jointed coupling between them so it could twist smoothly through all the loops and turns of the ride. There were 12 sections. The front of the first section was molded to look like a grinning demon face, with glowing red lights for eyes. The rest of the sections were smooth, red, candy-slick metal. Jason saw her reaction and squeezed her. "It's okay, baby," he said softly, big hand warm on the small of her back. "I'm telling you, there's nothing to worry about." "He's right, you know," said a voice behind them. This time Jason jumped a little, and they both turned around a bit too fast. Standing behind them were Ian McKinley and Aaron Ulmer, the high school's resident misfit goth couple. Ian was thin as a fingernail clipping and bone white, built like an awkward marionette with bad skin, sharp, hawkish features, and furtive, close-set blue eyes between tiny, steel-rimmed glasses. He wore an oversized black t-shirt that fit his scrawny shoulders like a cell and read "Smoke Crack and Worship Satan." His pipe-cleaner legs were snugly encased in slick black vinyl pants. His dyed black hair fell like a crow's wing across his high, shiny forehead, and his ears were heavy with thick steel rings and rivets. Everything about him, from his deliberately obnoxious t-shirt to his superior sneer, was designed to piss everyone else off as much as possible. But under his brittle "fuck you" glare, he gave off a strong vibe of beta male insecurity. He guarded Aaron like a bone, as if terrified that a bigger dog would take her away at any moment. Aaron was quite pretty, if a little on the heavy side. and Wendy could not help but imagine what she would look like without all the sooty eyeliner, ashy purple lipstick, and white pancake makeup. Her hair was a riot of black and blue dreadlocks around her wide heart-shaped face, and her dark eyes were huge and liquid like the eyes of an anime heroine. Silver bats dangled from her ears and nestled in her ample cleavage. Her nose, lower lip, and left eyebrow were all pierced, and her "fuck you" sneer seemed to have an ironic sense of humor behind it. You could see that she did not take herself nearly as seriously as Ian did. Wendy was always slightly unnerved by these two, not so much by their darker-than-thou air of gloomy glamour, but because they shared a jokey, elitist attitude that looked down on everyone and everything. They seemed to hate everyone in the world besides each other. "A roller coaster is just elemental physics," said Ian. "A conversion of potential energy to kinetic energy, right?" Aaron nodded, smirking. "Absolutely," she said. "The odds are only 1 in 250 million of dying while riding on a roller coaster," Ian said. "Highly improbable." "Right," Wendy said, not feeling even remotely reassured. "Of course, if you did die," Ian added, "it would be exceptionally messy." Jason glared at them and Wendy frowned. This kind of reassurance she didn't need. "Thanks for that, McKinley," Jason said. "Now, would you mind being creepy somewhere else?" Ian continued to lecture as if Jason hadn't spoken. "In fact," he said, "you're more likely to die driving to an amusement park than actually at one." "Yeah," said Jason, his teeth on edge. "I already said that. Thanks. Now, do you mind?" "Not at all," said Aaron, taking Ian's arm. "Forget we're even here. I know I've already forgotten you." Jason and Wendy turned back to Kevin and Carrie. Jason and Kevin exchanged a disgusted look. Kevin mouthed the word freaks. "Yeah," said Jason, "but look, forget them. If we want to sit in the front seats, we've got to snake up 5 spots. Wendy shivered. "Jason, listen," she said quietly. I don't want to be a pain, but I can't sit in front. I can't see the tracks. I'll freak." Jason groaned. "Wendy," he said, "come on. What's the point if you're not sitting in front?" "I'm sorry," she said, a hot, embarrassed flush creeping on her cheeks. "Look, I promised you I'd go on this thing, and I'm here, okay? But I just can't do that, please." "But I don't want to sit in the back," Jason whined like a bratty little boy. Kevin stepped between them. Hey, he said. "Let's not have any domestic incidents here. Don't worry about it. Carrie can sit with Wendy in the back." Carrie's mouth dropped open in outrage. "What?" she said. "Why me? 'Cause I'm a girl? Bitches in the back and that's that, huh? Forget it. I love roller coasters. I want to sit in front too." Carrie and Kevin looked at Jason, waiting for him to make a decision. Wendy squirmed with embarrassment. Why was she being such a wimp? She had no idea, but she just couldn't seem to help it. She was already freaked out enough. Sitting in front would be more than she could bear. It would kill her. "Go ahead, Jay," she said at last. "I'll live. You sit up front, I'll sit in the back." Nah, he said. "You can't sit by yourself. That's bullshit. Wendy could tell he wanted to do the chivalrous thing, but he couldn't seem to get the words out of his mouth. "Wait," said Kevin. He dug in his pocket and pulled out a quarter. "Call it." He flipped the coin in the air. "Heads," said Jason. Kevin caught the coin and slapped it down on the back of his left hand. He held the hand out. It had landed tails up. "Shit!" cried Kevin, pounding his legs with his fist. "Why did I do that? Dumbass!" He sighed. "Aw, what the fuck? It's the same ride, right?" Jason laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "Sure it is, dude. It's exactly the same. Thanks." He leaned in to murmur in Kevin's ear, but Wendy couldn't help overhearing. "Take care of Wendy for me, okay? She was kind of weirded out back there." Kevin held up his fist. "No worries," he replied. They touched fists. Carrie kissed Kevin on the cheek. "You're such a knight in shining armor," she said. Yeah, Kevin said with a surly frown. "Good guys always finish last." Carrie turned toward the front of the line and beckoned to Jason. "Well, come on," she said, tugging the neckline of her t-shirt down to reveal more cleavage. "And let me do the talking." She pushed past Frank's cheek, who was still busy trying to film Ashley and Ashlyn. The girls were obliviously talking on their respective cell phones, ignoring him completely. Beyond them was Lewis. Carrie slid in beside him, batting her eyes and whispering in his ear while squeezing her breasts together. Lewis grinned lasciviously. "No problem, girl," he replied. "Go for it." Jason followed her around the huge jock, and they continued forward. Wendy watched them for a moment and then turned back to Kevin. He was looking moody. She could tell he was still regretting his decision. "Thanks, Kevin," she said quietly. "I mean that. I really appreciate it." Kevin shrugged. "Forget it," he said. Next to them, Frank Cheek was trying again to engage Ashley and Ashlyn in conversation. They were still on their phones. He held up a cheap necklace he had around his neck. Dangling from it was a big chrome mudflap girl silhouette. "Like that?" he asked. "I want it on the wacky ladder. You know that rope ladder deal that wobbles? I like this. It's totally old school. I'm old school." Ashley curled a lip and covered the mic of her phone with her hand. "You're getting old, all right," she said. She exchanged a look with her friend and tilted her head forward. Ashlyn nodded without breaking her own phone conversation. She tapped Lewis on the shoulder and gave him a dazzling smile. Ashley did the same, pointing ahead of him. Lewis beamed back at them. "Sure thing, ladies. Go ahead, go ahead." He watched appreciatively as they squeezed past him and sashayed ahead. "You two can stand in front of me any time." Frank Cheek tried to look over Lewis's shoulder as his prey escaped him. It was impossible. Lewis was a foot taller than him and as wide as a door. Frank tapped the jock on the shoulder and tried to inch around him. Excuse me," Frank said. "I was with them." Lewis shifted his weight and crushed Frank against the rail. "Sorry, Cheek," he said, pushing Frank back with one casual hand. "No more room, brother." But nothing," Lewis said. "But out." Frank sighed and looked around for a new victim. He saw Wendy and gave her a long once-over that made her want to take 10 showers. She shuddered and looked away. Jason and Carrie had made their way to the very front of the line. Wendy saw Jason pump his fist and high-five with Carrie to celebrate their victory. They had won the front seats. Wendy wished she could be happy for Jason, but her feeling of dread was stronger than ever. The attendant directed Jason and Carrie to aisle 1 and started sending the rest of the line to the other aisles. The riders hurried to stand by the empty cars. He pointed Ashley and Ashlyn to car 7. The attendant was moving down the line. He pointed to Lewis. "How many?" he asked. Lewis held up a single finger. "Okay, hang on." The attendant pointed to Frank. "How many?" Frank tried to see around Lewis to Ashley and Ashlyn, trying to catch their eye, but they were already walking toward gate 7. He sighed, disappointed. "1, I guess," Frank replied. "Okay," the attendant said. "Hang on." The attendant looked at Kevin and Wendy. Kevin held up 2 fingers. The attendant nodded and pointed to the car. "Gate 8, he said. Kevin started forward, leading Wendy along, as the attendant pointed at Ian and Aaron, and then at a pair of younger kids. "At least we're not in the last car," he said. As they reached the gate, Wendy looked back down the line of people waiting to get in. But just then a scream of brakes and hydraulics made her jump and look around. Another train of 12 cars was sliding into the loading area, decelerating rapidly. The disheveled occupants cheered and laughed and sighed. The automatic restraining arms released, and they began to stand and wobble out of the cars onto the far platform. The gates for the car in front of her opened with a hiss and a bang. "Everybody in!" called the attendant. Lewis at gate 9 edged in, his bulk awkward in the right compartment, but Frank Cheek, waiting to get in beside him, was still craning to look at Ashley and Ashlyn, who were stepping through the gate and taking their seats in car 7. With a darting look at the attendant, he bolted forward and squirmed in front of Wendy and Kevin as they started through gate 8. He sat down behind Ashley and Ashlyn, looking triumphant. Kevin glared and stepped forward. "Hey, sleaze stack," Kevin said. "Those are our seats. Move your slimy ass." Sorry, Frank said, flipping out the view screen on his camera. "8's my lucky number. I have to sit here." The attendant's voice crackled over the loudspeakers. "Everybody in your seats, please." Kevin's fist clenched. He reached for Frank. Listen, scumbag, I'm going to pull you out of there by your sack if you don't... Wendy put a hand on his shoulder. Kevin, forget it, she said. Let's just sit in the back. Look, there's nobody in 12. Kevin looked up at her like she'd suggested he cut his hand off. In the back? He shook his head. No way, I don't wait all this time just to... The loudspeaker squawked again. Please take your seats. Yeah, Lewis called. Get in the rear, fish. You're used to that position. Wendy tugged on Kevin's arm. Come on, she said. It's not worth fighting over. Besides, you and Jason can go again after this. You said you were going to ride 10 times, so you still have 9 rides left to go, right? It's no big deal. Kevin grunted like it was a very big deal indeed, and gave Frank a fatal look, but did not resist as Wendy led him back to gate 12. They took their seats in the segment behind 2 younger boys, jostling and laughing as they squirmed in their seats and mock-punched each other. Don't worry about it, Ethan, one said to the other. But, Ethan responded. Look, the first boy said, with all the deep, profoundly jaded world-weariness of his 11 years. It's like no big deal. We're already in. You're being like a total puss. Hey, the attendant called, storming towards the car where Wendy and Kevin sat. For a moment, Wendy thought he was coming to throw her and Kevin off, and an embarrassing rush of relief washed over her. In front of her, the 2 boys scrunched down low in their seats as if trying to disappear. How'd you kids get through? The attendant asked the 2 boys. You're not tall enough to ride Devil's Flight. I told you, Harry, Ethan said. What do you mean? Harry protested. I'm 55 inches. Yeah, come here. The attendant hauled Harry and Ethan out of their seats and led them to a sign that read, You must be 54 inches to ride Devil's Flight. Painted along the side was an oversized ruler topped by an arrow pointed at 54 inches. He set the taller boy in front of the sign. The boy seemed to have made the grade by a 1/4 inch. See? He said. Yeah, I see, said the attendant. He put his hand on the top of the kid's head and pushed down. Wendy giggled as he saw the kid strain to keep his heels off the ground. He lost the fight and his feet fell flat to the floor. His head was just under the arrow. The attendant smirked. Nice try, Junior, he said. Come back in 6 months. This totally sucks, Harry said. That's the rules, kid, the attendant said. Out of my control. I told you they wouldn't let us on, Ethan said, as the attendant ushered them out. I told you. Bite me, buttwipe, Harry said. This is all your fault anyway, you big puss. As Wendy watched longingly after the boys, 2 whispering, giggling girls with the hoods of their brand-new Red River Park sweatshirts pulled up over their heads, slid into the vacated seat. Wendy guessed they were trying to keep their hair from getting messed up or something, but it seemed a little warm for long sleeves. Still, it was probably a good idea. Wendy wished she'd thought of bringing a hoodie, just a lightweight one. Her hair was going to be totally wrecked. Though honestly, at this point, she was far more worried about her nerves being wrecked. Kevin slouched down in his seat beside her and crossed his arms, starting to stare straight ahead. Worst roller coaster ride ever. Hey, Wednesday! Called a voice from up ahead. She looked up. Jason was waving and grinning at her from the front car. It looked like he was standing on his seat. Even so, she could barely see him over the Lewis's massive shoulders. She waved back. Hey! Shouted the attendant. Sit down and strap in. I'll meet you at the end, Jason called, sitting down and disappearing from view. Meet you at the end. For some reason, the words were very unsettling to her, and they echoed in Wendy's ears, until Kevin pulled in his lap bar, then reached up and tugged down the shoulder restraints. Their harsh, clacking racket snapped her back into focus. She set the lap bar and pulled down her own restraints. The padded U-shaped bar fit snugly over her shoulders. Kevin tested his, and she did the same. It was locked into place. There was no getting out now. 2 cars ahead of them, Lewis pulled his shoulder restraints down. They clicked into place, but when he tried to pull the lap bar forward, it bumped up against his big gut and stopped. It wouldn't lock. He looked up, worried. The attendant was walking down the car, checking everybody. Lewis pulled the lap bar in with his elbows and leaned on it. He gave the attendant a big smile. Good to go, dude, Lewis said. The attendant double-checked the bar. Lewis tightened his stomach. The bar didn't move. The attendant nodded and continued on to check Aaron and Ian's restraints. Lewis breathed a sigh of relief and let the bar rise up a little. It still wasn't locked. In front of him, Frank Cheek was leaning as far forward as he could, trying to talk to Ashley and Ashlyn. He reached out and stuck his digital video camera between their seats. "Hey," he said, "I dare you two to flash your tits at the top of the loop." Ashley and Ashlyn rolled their eyes dramatically. Wendy raised her camera high over her head and aimed down the car. Ahead of her, kids were waving their arms and shouting, "Let's go! Let's go!" If she was lucky, she could get everyone in the train. She squeezed the shutter button. The flash flared. The attendant, who had just checked their restraints, spun around. He glared at her, pointing to a sign. "Yo!" he said. "Can't you read?" He started toward them. Wendy looked at the sign even though she already knew what it said. No loose objects, no cameras. Wendy shrunk in her seat as the attendant loomed over her. Kevin took the camera from her and looked up at the attendant. "I'll put it in my pocket," he said. "All right?" The attendant hesitated for a moment and then nodded. "Fine," he said. Kevin stuffed the camera in the pocket of his loose-cut cargo pants. Ahead of them, Frank looked back and stealthily hid his DV cam up under his t-shirt. Satisfied that all was ship-shape, the attendant started back toward his control panel. Kevin grinned and leaned forward, gripping the lap bar in anticipation. "Finally, this is going to—" He paused. "Oh, gross!" He pulled his hand away from the bar, face scrunched up in disgust. A drooping line of bright pink chewing gum stretched from the bar to his palms. He tried to wipe it off the side of the car. The attendant stood at his console. He flipped the clear plastic safety casing that covered the launch button, which glowed a jaunty green. He grinned and raised his hand over his head. "And away we go!" he cried, and then pushed the button. The 12 little cars jolted forward as the guide wheels began turning against the metal pipe track. Wendy was rocked forward and then back. The other passengers raised their arms over their heads and cheered. Kevin, having cleaned most of the gum off his hand, joined them and elbowed Wendy in the arm. "Come on, Wendy!" he cried. "Get in the spirit! There's no stopping it now!" Wendy gave him a tight-lipped smile and half-heartedly raised her arms. In the lead car, Jason leaned forward, eager and bright-eyed. Beside him, Carrie smiled and gripped the overhead restraints with a happy tension. 8 cars back, Frank, now out of sight of the attendant, pulled his DV cam out of his shirt and started filming, holding it over his head, trying to frame both Ashley and Ashlyn and the rising rails of the lift hill in the shot. Wendy listened to the clacking of the gears as the car slowly approached the climb. Then the train jerked to a stop at the base of the hill, eliciting nervous giggles and whoops from the riders. The rails rose above her like twin sword blades, 250 feet above her head. It looked like they went all the way to the moon. A gear engaged beneath the car, and it resumed its slow ascent. Clack, 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 clack. The car's angle increased sharply, pushing Wendy back in her seat. She felt like she was in the cockpit of a rocket on the launch pad. Her feeling of helplessness was almost overwhelming, but she did not want to disintegrate in front of Kevin. She looked out to the side and saw the lights of the park falling away below her, and the starlit sky filling more and more of her vision. They were 15 stories up, now 16, 17. The car's angle became even steeper, and the constant clacking became strained. She could see the summit approaching and clenched the shoulder restraints with white knuckles. Another 10 seconds of agonizing tension, and the car began to level off, 25 stories above the ground. The car slowed and stopped at the crest, and pitched slightly forward so that Wendy leaned into the restraints. She held her breath. The whole park was spread out below her. The flashing, whirling lights and colorful structures were a puddle of chaos in the darkness of the surrounding orchard. Beyond them, and spreading to the horizon, she could see the more ordered, sedate, yellow glow of halogen-lit suburban streets. There was a hiss and a clang as the brakes released, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the train began to roll forward. It edged into the downhill curve, toward angle increasing, and began picking up speed. Beside her, Kevin let out a rebel yell. The whole train echoed him, a unified screech of delighted horror. In the front seat, Jason and Carrie clutched the lap bar, grinning and screaming like happy lunatics as the cars plunged down the 50-degree incline and the wind ripped at their clothes. In car 7, Ashley and Ashlyn were pressed back in their seats, their eyes wide. Frank Cheek struggled to keep his camera in front of him and focused on the shrieking girls. Lewis held on to the lap bar. He almost seemed to be trying to steer the car with his massive arms. Aaron and Ian sat stoic and apparently calm as the wind whipped their hair back from their faces. The only sign of nervousness they displayed was the fact that they held hands with bone-crushing intensity. Wendy found she could not concentrate on anything but keeping herself together. The train plunged on, corkscrewing slightly as it dropped, then hit the bottom of the first valley and roared up the second rise, a towering hill of steel almost as high as the first, but ascended in a fraction of the time. In spite of herself, the thrill of the speed and motion and the sensation of her stomach rising inside her ribcage was lifting Wendy's spirits. What a rush it was to fly like this, to have all her earthbound cares fall away, like the ground below her, and have her life be reduced to speed, wind, and torque. She shrieked with joyful abandon. Kevin grinned at her. "There you go!" he shouted. "I knew you were going to love it!" She could barely hear him. The cars reached the top of the second hill and banked into a sharp, descending turn. Inertia threw Wendy and the others into the restraints, and they struggled to remain centered. Wendy looked ahead, and her giddy scream died in her throat as the rest of the coaster's track was revealed to her, twisting away like a gnarled vine. At the base of the hill the cars had just topped was the first loop, a 180-degree, 50-foot-high vertical circle of track. Upside down, she thought. We're going upside down. The presence of the restraints did not reassure her. The fact that thousands upon thousands of people had survived the trip before her did nothing to calm her terror. She was going to fall out of the car. She was going to die. The train straightened out of the curve, then plummeted into the drop, racing for the loop. Jason and Carrie screamed, eyes bright. Kevin pumped his fist over his head. Wendy held the bar in a death grip. Frank pointed his camera toward the loop. "Here it comes!" he shouted. The tracks blurred as the car screamed into the upturn. The G-forces were incredible. Wendy was squashed down into her seat like some giant was flattening her with his palm. The world rotated around her as the cars rocketed up the inside curve of the loop. The passengers shrieked and howled like a single, exhilarated entity. She squeezed her eyes shut, but not being able to see what was happening made it a billion times worse. She opened them again and tried to focus on the other riders. Frank thrust his DV cam into Ashley and Ashlyn's car, and between their seats. He turned it toward them. "Now!" he screamed. "Show me your titties!" Amazingly, Ashley seemed game. She grabbed the bottom of her flimsy top and started to pull it up, but she could barely move her arms, and the restraints were in the way. She strained, but lost her grip and her arm, and it pushed sideways by the wind, smashed into Frank's hand just as the train reached the apex of the loop and turned completely upside down. Jarred, Frank lost his grip on the camera, and it tumbled from his hand. He made a desperate pawing grab for it, but it bounced off his fingertips and spun away, dropping like a stone. "Shit!" said Frank. Wendy's eyes squeezed shut as, upside down, her shoulders pressed against the top of the restraints. Lewis's eyes bugged out as his lap bar, which had never fully locked, began to open away from his stomach. He clutched at it, panicked, and tried to pull it in, but his arms fought against the centrifugal pull and lost. He clung instead to his shoulder restraints. The car started down the other half of the loop. Below them, Frank Cheek's camera smashed off the superstructure of the ride, glass and bits of metal flying, and bounced to a rest on the outgoing loop track. Its broken lens pointed directly toward the train, which barreled down at it at 100 miles an hour. The guide wheels bumped over the camera, crushing it, and were jolted out of position. Twisted, one of the four wheels wobbled furiously, and the camera shot out from under the rubber wheels like a missile and ricocheted off the undercarriage of the cars. It hit a hydraulic piston right on the seam and split it. At rest, the tiny crack would have done nothing, but at the speed the car was moving and with the incredible pressures it was under, it wrenched wide open and began jetting oil everywhere. Jason and Carrie screamed, this time with real terror, as the car rocked back and forth, and they were thrown against their shoulder restraints. Their screams turned to hysterical shrieks as the restraints, depressurized because of the broken hydraulic piston, released and rose up over their heads. And theirs weren't the only ones. All the shoulder restraints for the whole car released. The passengers grabbed desperately to pull them back down, but G-forces made it hard for them to raise their arms. Louis, teeth bared and eyes huge with terror, held on to his broken shoulder restraint with one hand and the lap bar that had never locked with the other. He was praying furiously in Spanish. The cars roared out of the loop and into a low bump. Wendy clung to the lap bar as she rose out of her seat. Kevin tried to hold her in with one arm as he held on with the other. Her eyes widened as she saw, rushing toward them, a twisting corkscrew turn. "Oh!" Before she could say no, they were barreling into the rifled loop. Without being held in place by the shoulder restraints, she and Kevin were thrown violently from side to side. Her elbow cracked him in the face. Blood spurted from his split lips, splattering her t-shirt. In front of them, Aaron and Ian smashed together in a chaos of black-clad limbs. The hoodie-clad girls bounced like rag dolls, upside down again and dazed. Kevin tried to hold himself and Wendy in the car, as gravity, like the claw of some immensely strong demon, fought to pull him loose and hurl him to the ground below. Under the train, the wobbling guide wheel finally gave up the ghost and flew off. The axle dropped onto the metal track pipe, a spray of white sparks bathing the undercarriage of the car. The track groaned and shuddered with the unaccustomed strain. All over the ride, the support post and beams shifted and swayed. Further down the track, a pipe weld cracked. Ashley, her breast suddenly exposed as her top flapped up around her chin, banged painfully against Ashlyn, and then away again as the train screamed into a swooping S-turn. The track dipped. At the front of the cars, Jason and Carrie held their arms in front of their faces as a shower of hot sparks bounced off them. The train shot up a steep incline, then whiplashed into a sharp turn. With the guide wheel gone, the centrifugal force was too much, and as the train pulled sideways, the end of the lead car's axle slipped off the rail and jammed into the ties that held the tracks together. The speed and mass of the train were too much for this to stop it entirely, but the first car shimmied and bucked as the axle tore through tie after tie. At last, the torque twisted the car too far and it popped off the track, continuing straight while the track slewed left. Jason and Carrie screamed in terror. The rest of the train began to follow suit, segmented cars popping off one by one and arcing after the first. As the rest of the train continued around the curve and the derailed cars bent back on the others, the coupling between the 8th and 9th cars snapped, ripping cables and hydraulic hoses. Louis was slammed against the back of his seat as the cars holding Frank Cheek and Ashley and Ashlyn plummeted off the right side of the rails and headed for the ground. The violence of the brake caused Louis to lose his grip on his loose restraints, and he bounced out of the car. Only a last-second grab at the edge of the door saved him from falling. He clung to the outside of the car with all of his strength, bellowing with terror. The sheet metal skin of the cab had torn when the coupling broke, and it was peeling back in the wind. It flapped violently, gashing Louis's arm and face. Below him, the front 8 car smashed through support pipes and posts like they were twigs, and then piled into the ground and flattened, like an aluminum beer can being crushed on the forehead of a drunken jock. The cars rocketed on, roaring up a low rise and then dropping suddenly. The force of the drop was too severe. Louis lost his grip as the car jolted down, and he fell back as the remaining cars rushed by. Kevin saw Louis's massive body flying toward him and instinctively let go of his restraints and reached out to catch him. He wrapped his arms around Louis's body like he was sacking a quarterback as the big jock slammed into him with a bone-crunching impact. Kevin gasped, all the wind knocked out of him. Louis clutched desperately at Kevin, cursing and shuddering, but his grip was slipping. He fell out of Kevin's arms, but managed to catch the side of Kevin and Wendy's car. His fingers were torn and bloody, and he struggled to keep his grip. Kevin leaned out of the car and grabbed the back of Louis's baggy shorts, trying to pull him back in. Wendy held on to Kevin's waist, bracing him, but even with her help, Kevin couldn't get enough leverage. Louis outweighed him by a good 50 pounds. Kevin grunted and strained, but couldn't pull the massive jock back in. Louis tried desperately to pull himself up, and after a second he gained a little purchase. Keep pulling! He shouted. I'm almost... Before he could finish the sentence, the ripped sheet metal cowling from the first cab finally tore free and flew back. Lewis heard it flapping through the air like some sinister bird of prey and looked forward, just in time for it to smash into him, chopping into his arms and forehead like a cleaver. With a terrified shriek, Lewis was knocked from the car and ripped from Kevin's grip. He fell, flailing before being folded in half by smashing into a support beam. His lifeless body tumbled limply downward, plummeting 4 stories to the ground. The broken cowling spun away, trailing pieces of the coupling assembly, bouncing off supports and smashing into the previously weakened pipe weld. The crack widened, torn apart by the reverberations that rippled up and down the tracks from the impact of the cowling and the devastation of the first 9 cars ripping through the coaster's superstructure. Unable to withstand the unforeseen stresses being placed upon it, the weld ruptured completely and dropped, pulling a section of rails down with it, creating a 3-inch drop in the track at the break. Above, what remained of the train hurled on, sparks flying from the damaged front. It angled into a curve, then began a 5-story drop straight for the broken rails in the last loop of the ride, just beyond that. As the car shot down the curving decline, a torn end of hydraulic hose whipped out of the hole in the front car and flapped around, spraying oil everywhere. All the lap restraints released at once, rising away from the passengers. Wendy gasped, breathlessly moaning, "Oh no! Oh no! Oh no!" She and Kevin braced their feet against the front of the car, clinging to the raised and wobbly shoulder restraints. The swift loss of altitude was lifting Ian and Aaron from their seats. They clung to each other and the restraints. The train hit the bottom of the hill at terminal velocity, and the passengers were slammed back down into their seats. It roared over the 3-inch drop in the broken track. Wendy and Kevin bounced back and forth, banging each other with elbows and knees, but amazingly the train stayed on the track. Unfortunately, the 3-inch drop at the speed was enough to snap 2 of the guide wheels off the axle of the lead car, and the truncated train squealed under a low-hanging support beam and up into the inbound curve of the big loop, grinding sparks from its axles. The friction began to slow it down, and just before it reached the apex of the loop, it came to a stop, almost completely upside down, the few remaining guide wheels holding it to the track. Wendy and Kevin clung to the dangling shoulder restraints for dear life. Aaron and Ian did the same, but Ian, seeing Aaron slipping, reached out to catch her and lost his own tenuous grip on the car instead. With a girlish scream, he plummeted toward the ground. "Ian!" shrieked Aaron. She reached down for him with one hand, and the fingers of the other slipped off the bar, and she fell after him, a flapping black taffeta missile that smashed into red ruin on the tracks below. Wendy looked around, holding on to the shoulder restraints like a kid dangling from the monkey bars. Kevin dangled beside her. They had stopped, and all was silent. "Are we?" she asked. Is it over?" Kevin swallowed. "Maybe," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Maybe if we just hang on." But just as he spoke, there was a deafening squeal of steel on steel, and the train began to slide back down the curve of the loop in reverse. As it picked up velocity and righted itself, Wendy was slammed back into the car, but a button on the sleeve of Kevin's varsity jacket was caught on the shoulder restraint, and he swung awkwardly from it, his feet just brushing the seat. He jerked on the button. It wouldn't rip. "Fuck!" he cursed, and standing on tiptoe he tried to free his sleeve, while the train hurtled blindly backwards. He couldn't get it off. He needed to be 5 inches higher. He pushed himself up on the tip of the roof. The button came free. A shape hurtling toward him made him look up. With a sudden, fearsome impact, the low-hanging beam that had shot under earlier tore him into ragged, bloody halves. Wendy shrieked. The low-hanging beam they had shot under earlier tore him into ragged, bloody halves. Wendy shrieked as hot gore sprayed her from head to foot, and Kevin's legs and lower torso flopped to the floor of the cab. her camera bouncing out of his pocket and skittering away. Wendy gagged and covered her eyes while behind her Kevin's head, arms, and crushed and shattered chest slid off the pole and fell wetly to the ground. She was all alone, facing backwards as her hair whipped around her eyes in a speeding coaster train with the severed legs of her dead boyfriend's best friend bleeding all over her shoes. Could things get any worse? The train sped toward the long hill that it had raced down before. Just before the hill, at the low point of the valley, was the break in the track. Coming forward, it was a 3-inch drop, but going backward, it was a 3-inch rise, a still curve. The wheels of Wendy's car, the last car, slammed into the raised tracks and stopped dead. Wendy was smashed into her seat with an impact that cracked her skull and shot blood from her nose and eyes. In front of her, 3 cars, all ominously empty, rose off the track and curled over her head like the tail of a scorpion as inertia kept them moving. Wendy's car was torn from the tracks and turned upside down as the other cars pulled it up and back. Only semi-conscious, as blood filled her brain pan and shock started to close her body down, she saw the ground racing up at her in a red-tinged blur. The first car smashed into the concrete, then the second, and then, "Yo," the attendant said, "can't you read?" Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 3 of Final Destination 3, the novelization by Christa Faust. And I gotta say, I love this woman's writing style. Like, I thought I was on that roller coaster as I was narrating it. I'm sure you can hear it in my voice. It was so intense. She really makes you care about these characters, and she puts you in the moment. I would love to interview her someday. But yeah, I thought this was an amazing chapter. I thought the disaster played out really intense, really vivid. I loved the way she wrote it out. You could see every bit of it happening, even more so than in the movie. So I'm really pumped for the rest of this book because I love her writing style. And yeah, this was an intense disaster scene. She made me feel like I was on the roller coaster, living through this, seeing it all happen right in front of my eyes, even more vivid than the movie did with it, I think. We got a lot more details about what was going on, and it wasn't going by so fast. We're actually able to soak it in, you know. I can't wait to see how this is going to play out, because some of the characters are a bit differently written in the book than they were in the movie. So I'm curious to see how it's going to play out when she, starts freaking out and the people get off the ride. The ones that do. I don't want to give away any spoilers. But we already know that she just had a premonition, because at the end it snapped back to what the attendant had said earlier, so I'm not spoiling anything there. But I do like the addition of a few more characters, the goths and everything. That's always great to add more, more variety to your cast of characters. I don't want to spoil it, but a lot of us who've seen the movie do know who the hooded people are up ahead of her on the roller coaster, and that plays a big part in this book, in the movie as well. I'm assuming it plays a big part in the book. Anyways, I really liked the character development tonight, and I loved the premonition of the disaster. I cannot give it high enough praise. It was really well written, put me in the moment, put me on the roller coaster. I saw every inch of this disaster happening in my head. It was so intense. I hope you all enjoyed it too. I'll be back very soon with more of Final Destination 3. Please let me know in the comment section below if you're enjoying this book so far, what you think of Christa Faust, if you've listened to my audiobook of the Jason Strain and Nightmare on Elm Street Dream Spawn, And if you enjoy her writing as well, if you're enjoying how she's writing this story, because, yeah, this isn't my favorite Final Destination movie, but so far, I feel like this book's going to end up being my favorite Final Destination book so far, and I really loved Looks Could Kill and Death of the Senses, so we'll see how it goes. Alright, Slashaholics, thank you so much for listening, for subscribing. Be sure to click that thumbs up button. Be excellent to each other. I love you all. And until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s Slasher librarian, signing off.
But remember, the risk of cheating the plan, of disrespecting the design, could incite a fury that could terrorize even the Grim Reaper. And you don't even want to fuck with that